I've been tasked this evening with talking about what happens after the Buddha's enlightenment. And I have to say, I was a little bit reluctant to take up this talk at first because I quite like the idea that enlightenment is a sort of spiritual retirement home where I could finally relax. But if we look at the Buddha's life story, what we find, what we see is that enlightenment is not the end. In a sense, it's the beginning. And in the conclusion of last night's talk, I think my takeaway, in a sense, was that we just don't know what enlightenment is. We can talk about it in terms of poetry and paradox and metaphor, but because it's beyond concepts and it's beyond the rational mind, we can't really say what it is. But from what ensues in the Buddha's life story, what we can see is that enlightenment is just the furthest point on the horizon that we can see. It's not the end. It's more like a point of indefinite development. So it's not a fixed state. It's more of a dynamic state. It keeps unfolding. And we can see that by how the Buddha responds to things, to people after his enlightenment. So the first thing that happens after his enlightenment is that he sits under the tree for 7 weeks, absorbing the experience, just as we might sit on for a couple minutes after we have a breakthrough in meditation. And then, and this isn't in the scriptures, but then there's the point where he opens his eyes. He knows he's broken through into a totally new type of consciousness, suffused with wisdom and compassion and energy, and he's reached the end of suffering. And his first thought is of us. So he's coming from this point of view of liberation from suffering. He will no longer suffer. He's reached the end of suffering. And the first thing that he turns towards is towards us. And what he sees is that we are suffering. So I want to say a little bit more about suffering from the Buddhist point of view. We all know that we suffer. We suffer the dissatisfaction of everyday, ordinary life. We suffer psychological blocks and emotional entanglements and all the relational dynamics that we get into. There's the existential suffering, whether that's feeling a bit lost or directionless, like I did after university, or feeling conflicted or a lack of meaning. And then there's the overt pain, like sickness or losing someone we love. And there's a suffering of craving as well. I think that in our lives in London nowadays, with all of the technology, actually it's very possible to avoid experiencing the full force of our craving. I mean, if I want something, there's Amazon Prime next day delivery, there's Deliveroo in 45 minutes, and there's Netflix and all this streaming on demand. So it's only when I'm on a retreat that I experience the full force of my craving, and actually that's a real state of suffering. But from the Buddhist point of view, suffering is much deeper than this actually, or it goes beyond this as well. So in Buddhism, rebirth is taken as given. And what rebirth is, well, that's above my pay grade. I couldn't tell you because I don't really understand myself. Sometimes it's described as something like something continues, but no thing continues when we die. So there's no fixed essence of me. There's no soul that continues. That's an illusion, but something continues. So when it comes to rebirth, one option is to take it as a metaphor, we talk about, or people talk about, I don't know, their past life as a lawyer, their past life where they had a marriage or something like that. And we could think about it as how each moment, through what we do with our minds, through how we act, conditions the next moment. So we are constantly reborn. So you don't need to believe in rebirth, as it were, to be a Buddhist. The truth of suffering applies to a single lifetime. So when it comes to the Buddha's teaching on the endless rounds of rebirth, the endless cycle of being born and dying, you could just take that as a symbol. Death is a symbol or a metaphor here for suffering. So the question is something like, how do we suffer again and again? So I get a lot of migraines, so I could just think of myself as an endless round of migraines. Or maybe you think of yourself in an endless round of dissatisfying jobs or disappointing relationships. You could think of that as your endless round of rebirth. In our day and age, I think that a lot of the time we're actually pretty sheltered from death. I know I've been really sheltered from death. But in the Buddha's day, death would have been much more present in this sort of, ancient India was like there would be some death all around them, children dying, deaths in childbirth, etc. So you could take it that way. Or you could just experiment with taking up the perspective that maybe there is something to this. Maybe there is something to the Buddhist perspective that we are wandering in delusion in an endless number of lives, a frightful sequence of rebirths. And from that perspective, the goal of the Buddhist life and what the Buddha achieved is going beyond this cycle of continuous birth and death altogether. So I think for myself, I was only able to grasp the treasure of the Dharma and how precious the Buddha's teachings were when I opened up to this idea. Because I think in a certain way, from the point of view of a single lifetime, life can be not very painful. So speaking for myself, I would definitely be a Buddhist no matter what. But yeah, I have a lot of headaches. My parents had a messy divorce. But other than that, I have a really nice job. I have a really nice boyfriend. I do a lot of yoga. I'm okay. So it's this perspective of a frightful sequence of rebirths that really, really activated me in my practice, feeling like I sort of saw this, and at least in the sense of faith, I saw this. That's what really got me to garner enough momentum in my practice to get myself ordained, really. So whether you take that as a metaphor or not, that's up to you. The Buddha let his eye rest upon this sequence of rebirths. He saw how entangled we are. He saw how much hatred and craving and delusion we have in our hearts, as we'll all maybe have seen now in meditation. And when reflecting on whether he would be able to communicate his breakthrough, understandably, he had a little bit of a tremor. So this tremor was, this Dharma that I have attained is deep, hard to see, hard to realize, peaceful, refined, beyond the scope of conjecture, subtle, to be experienced by the wise. So he asks himself, could I communicate the Dharma? Could I pass this on to others? And in response, he didn't have a thought, he didn't have a concept, he had a vision. And the vision was of a god called Brahma Sahampati, which means something like Lord of 1,000 worlds. So the gods in Buddhism, they are subordinate to the Buddha, because the Buddha has been liberated from any realm of re-becoming. So we're in the human realm, where there's about an equal mix of suffering and pleasure in our lives. And in the Buddhist tradition, they talk of a God realm as well. And the God realm is nicer than this one. It's where these sort of spiritual beings can dwell in states of refined pleasure and bliss. But the point is, that's not freedom. They're just there for a little bit. It's another temporary realm, just like we might have a temporarily blissful meditation or blissful day on retreat. So it's subordinate to what the Buddha has achieved. That's why Buddhists don't want to go to heaven. Yeah? So, so I think that actually we can kind of use our spiritual practice. We don't really get that, so we can try and use our spiritual practice to try and get into a sort of God realm for ourselves. There's actually a Buddhist text from the 13th century that says that in the future there will be people walking around in white with blissful smiles on their faces, who do lots of fasting and yoga, and this is not the way to freedom. So I've never been to Bali, but I think that's like the sort of temporary realm that I want to escape to sometimes. Yeah, so I do have to ask myself in my practice, am I really aiming for liberation, or am I just trying to get into a more refined realm of pleasure? And can I really see that that will only be temporary? There's no total liberation to be found there. And this is really relevant in my work as well. So my job is I help really wealthy people give money to charity. And they're usually tech founders. So they're sort of the epitome of success. And what some of us might aspire to in a sort of a worldly way. And these people have really, really nice lives. We sort of run luxury retreats for them where they think about which charity to give to. And my experience of them is that, well, they're sort of in like the God realm, if you take it more metaphorically, like the sort of nicest it can get for us, what we might aspire to. And knowing them, having personal relationships with them, what I can see is they're just suffering in prettier ways. And we can do this as well. We can sort of collect spiritual experiences, psychedelic experiences, and lots of different meditative techniques and schools to get into lots of different fancy states and have lots of big experiences. Yeah, well, it doesn't really work because all those states are temporary. This is what the Buddha discovered, right, as Dayanatha was saying last night. And I got into this too. I got really into meditation technique at some point, and I learned how to get into all these blissful states. And at some point, I just remember realizing, oh my goodness, this is a dead end. It's a spiritual dead end because we go up, but we go down. And in my case, I land with a bump. So it's one of those like after the ecstasy, the laundry situations. I mean, it's nuanced because I don't think I would have been able to throw myself into Buddhism if there wasn't a lot of pleasure in meditation, a lot of pleasure in the spiritual life. But it's important to see like what that can and cannot give us. So that was a bit of a digression, but the Buddha's tremor was answered by a god, Brahma Sahampati. The god realm is subordinate to the Buddha's total liberation. And maybe another way you could just think of this god, Brahma Sahampati, is as the personification of humanity's spiritual cry for liberation that comes from any realm. So within all of humanity, that cry for spiritual freedom. And he says, there are beings with little dust in their eyes who are falling away because they do not hear the Dharma. There will be those who will understand the Dharma. So I think he's talking about those of us who are receptive to the idea that we can work on our minds, that we can change our minds, that we can transform our minds. We can be receptive to the Buddha's teachings. And in response to this, the Buddha did not have another thought. He did not have another concept. He had another vision. And the vision was of lotuses. So lotuses as a vision of humanity. So it says, he surveyed the world with his eye of an awakened one. And as he did so, he saw beings with little dust in their eyes, those with keen faculties and those with dull, those with good attributes and those with bad, those easy to teach and those hard. Just as in a pond of blue or red or white lotuses, some lotuses might flourish while immersed in the water, some might stand at an even level with the water, while some might rise up from the water, so too, surveying the world with the eye of the awakened one, the Blessed One saw beings with little dust in their eyes. So this is a vision of humanity as diverse. So the diverse colors of the lotuses, the diverse shapes of the lotuses, the flourishing in different environments above the water, in the water. But it's also a vision of sameness. So there are only lotuses, there are no gnats, there are no slugs, there are no worms. And that's quite a radical doctrine, actually, especially at the time. It was a radical vision. There are no chosen ones. Yeah, everyone is a lotus. Every human life is precious. At the same time, it's not a vision of equality. So there are some lotuses that are taller, that are more fully blooming than others. And I can definitely see this in my own life. I have met my teachers. I've come across people who are definitely more spiritually developed than I am. And for me, that's just such a relief, because if I were the epitome of human development, that would be very sad. But maybe for some of us, that's something that we can resist, that the idea that some people are more developed than others we can react to. And I think it's important to remember that this sort of hierarchy is a natural one, and it would just be really obvious. It would just open up in communication based on who is more aware and more compassionate. So actually, it's a gift. And at the same time, it's a vision of sameness, right? So everyone is able to grow. Everyone is able to become enlightened. Yeah, so I went to international school, and at international school, what they say is that you can do anything when you grow up. So this wasn't, you could think it's something like that, but it's not. So this is a vision of, that's not about achievement or ability, right? It's more about preciousness or sacredness even. There's something innately meaningful about each of our lives, innately precious. So my strongest experience of this was when I was training for ordination, and I was in a group, just like the groups that we are having here on this retreat, with a woman who was checking in one day about how she doesn't trust or feel that life is intrinsically meaningful. So she feels like she needs to work really hard to make life meaningful. And after that, I went into meditation, and I just brought her to mind, and I just could see it for her. I was just like, oh, can't she see that there's something innately precious and worthy about her? And then I thought, hold on, if that's true for her, that's true for me too. And I've been very cheerful since then. Yeah. So all beings can grow. No one is stained. There are no lost causes. The nature of mind includes the seeds for Buddhahood in all of us. And maybe we've had glimpses of this. I think I get it a little bit during the communication exercise, where I feel like I can see people's potential just by taking them in more fully. It's like everyone lights up from their own side on retreat when I'm just a little bit less self-obsessed. So on that basis, the Buddha decides, open are the doors to the deathless, to those with ears, let them show their faith. So deathless, again, is synonym for enlightenment, the end of the cycle of life and death. So at this point, the Buddha has seen that we suffer, and he has seen our potential, and it's on that basis that he decides to teach. So that's the enlightened mind of wisdom and of love meeting suffering. And when a mind of love meets suffering, the love turns into compassion. And that's compassion in its truest sense, because it's compassion that's based both on seeing that we suffer and seeing our potential. So what happens with me is usually I overemphasize seeing suffering, and then I get a little bit distressed or feel really sorry or get a bit despondent. Or I overemphasize seeing people's potential, and then I get frustrated because I want them to sort of get it together. So for us, we will rarely actually have a glimmer of true compassion that's not blinded by those sort of wrong views or extremes. It's quite a subtle thing, compassion, because our sense of self is very, very strong, so we polarize with others. But maybe on this retreat already you'll have had a sense of this. When the sense of self thins out, it becomes more refined, then we're able to respond to others more spontaneously, more fully, in a way that's not about us. And I think the idea is that at some point that sense of self evaporates altogether into sort of positivity. So a lot of the time what we're actually experiencing is the near enemies of compassion. So one of those is sort of guilt or horrified anxiety or any form of over-responsibility, which basically, if we're going to be uncharitable about it, it can be summarized as it's making me uncomfortable that you're suffering. So if it's causing us distress, then it's not actually compassion, it's something else. True compassion comes from the extinguishing of self and other. So yes, it's very easily confused, so we don't need to give ourselves a hard time about this. Often we mean really well. I remember I live in a women's community, a young women's community at the London Buddhist Center, and I had my teacher over for dinner, and no one was talking. It was so quiet. And I was like, come on, you guys, like, can you like say something so it'll be a nice time for Vajratara? But of course, it wasn't actually about Vajratara. Vajratara was fine. Actually, I was uncomfortable because I felt awkward. So we do things like that all the time. We feel uncomfortable and then we try and fix it. And that's not exactly what compassion is. Maybe if I'd been more aware, I could have seen that some of these young women were just feeling a little bit intimidated around this very senior teacher and a little bit shy. So the other extreme that we can go into is a sort of sentimental pity. That's sort of feeling sorry for other people, but in a way that's sort of glad it's them and not me. And what that is, I think that when I get into that, what's happening is that I've gotten disconnected from my own suffering somehow. So I'm feeling sorry someone else is a mess. And someone called me out on this the other day. He was like, look, I've seen your bedroom. So there's more that flavor of me and you involved, you see. And we'll know that being on the other side of any of these things as well, it's really quite uncomfortable. Because what it can feel like from the other side is you have to reassure people who are, when you're the one who's having a hard time. Yeah. So compassion, true compassion, is truly concerned with the other. And we feel for the other as if it was ourselves. And that's maybe what we'll have glimpses of on retreat, maybe when our sense of self is more refined. And what that can feel like is like it comes from real lightness, and it's volitional, so it's accompanied with sort of wanting to reach out. It's a sort of action. So that was what the Buddha's mind was like when he gained enlightenment. It was full of compassion of this sort, not just the emotion, but full of the volition as well, of action. Compassion is the way one acts. So what he did not do is go and preach at the local village, or I think maybe the modern equivalent of that would be starting a YouTube channel or tweeting about it. What he did is he thought of his friends. I think it's worth saying as well, what he did not do is what was traditional at the time, which was just to sit there and wait for people to come to him. He decided to go. So he was thought of his friends because he thought, who can I communicate this to? First he thought of his teachers, actually, but through his sort of omniscient eye of awakening, he could see that they had already died. So he thought of those who he had gratitude for. He thought of those who he thought he could share his spiritual ideals with and communicate with on that basis. So after he thought about his teachers, he thought of his friends. So the 5 ascetics Dayanatha was mentioning yesterday, who he practiced these self-mortification practices with. So that, I guess the goal of that was to release the mind by subduing the body. And the Buddha found out that this was not the way, but he respected their efforts and he thought, these were my friends, maybe I could communicate this to them. And I think that's really relatable, actually. I think when we come across Buddhism, what we do often is that we think of our friends and we sort of go home to our friends and we try and speak to them about it. I know for me, it's a friend who brought me to the Buddhist Center, and then I brought a friend. I actually stayed involved because I made a friend. And then the friend that I brought his girlfriend. So it's a sort of network of friendship, the Buddhist community. So the Buddha thought of his friend, and he realized that they were 100 miles away. He just knew. So there would have been hundreds, maybe thousands of people on the way to meet his friends, but that's the people he thought, I can communicate with them. So he walked there, and it took about a week. And on the way, he bumped into another sort of spiritual wanderer called Upaka. And Upaka was very impressed with the Buddha's appearance. He had a sort of glow about him, as any sort of practitioner will sort of develop, even over the course of a retreat. And Upaka stopped the Buddha and asked him 2 questions. Who is your teacher, and what is your doctrine? And the Buddha answered, I am an arhat of the world, the unexhaled teacher. I am rightly self-awakened. Cooled am I, unbound. In a world become blind, I beat the drum of the deathless. So Upaka just looked at him, and he shook his head, and he said, may it be so, my friend, and just took a side road. And Upaka may well have missed out on a really big opportunity. He disappears from Buddhist scriptures, he disappears from Buddhist history. And I think from our point of view, sometimes it's easy to take a story like this and think like, oh yeah, that's like, I don't know, like people at work or something like that who aren't really receptive to this kind of thing. That's not like me. But actually with Buddhist teachings, it's always good to take up the perspective of compassion and kindness is for other people, and the wisdom teachings are for myself. So actually we will have lots of dust in our eyes. We will be blind to the Buddha, to the Buddha's teachings. We're the unenlightened ones. So one of the ways that I have dust in my eyes is that when I'm listening to Dharma talks, often what I listen to is the melody instead of the lyrics. So I'll decide if I think the speaker is funny and engaging rather than actually listen to what they're saying. And I think I'm just like this in life in general, actually. It's sort of like my cross to bear or something. I always make friends with the funny and attractive people instead of like trying to find who can I have a deeper communication with. Something I've really had to work on. And then other ways I have dust in my eyes. I think that I've had moments on retreat, for instance, where I'll just decide that the teacher is not wise enough for me, not articulate enough for me, or the other people aren't deep enough. And then, that's a really, really good way to sort of shut my eyes and ears to whatever is being offered on the retreat and get very little out of it. And I can be blind, actually. I can have dust in my eyes as well in regards to institutions. So in our tradition, it can take any length of time, really, but on average, it takes about 7 years to get ordained. And after 3 years, I thought, I'm ready. So, but I wasn't getting ordained after 3 years, so I just thought we have an institutional problem on our hands. I tried to take that up with my teacher. It didn't go well for me. Those are a few ways that I can have dust in my eyes and just be blind to the preciousness of what's being offered. So the Buddha finally makes his way to meet his friends, to meet these 5 ascetics. And when they see him, they see him from a distance, and they just think to themselves, they say to each other, that's the one who gave up. That's the one who went back to eating solid food and living luxuriously. Let's show him no respect. But as he got closer, they just couldn't help themselves. They couldn't help but sort of be taken by his presence. So they made him a nice seat. They brought him a bowl to wash his feet. They took his bowl. They took his robe. And they couldn't help but be taken by him. And what ensued, so there were 5 of them, is a sort of seminar, a sort of discussion group. So two of the friends, two of the ascetics would go and get some alms, so get food in the village, and 3 of them would stay and get instruction from the Buddha. And they'd meditate together and they'd discuss the Dharma, and they did this for 12 weeks. And you can imagine that sometimes maybe the Buddha would go off for a little bit and they'd discuss amongst each other as well. Did you get that bit? Because I wasn't so sure about that. So what you can hear around the London Buddhist Center sometimes, or just around our tradition, is that the Dharma is not taught, it's caught. So we pick up how to practice, we pick up the Dharma by being around people who exemplify it. I think that communication is really the thing that, to me, most exemplifies going deeply inwards and going deeply outwards. It's like the boundary between those two disappears. So when we hear people articulating their experience and then it really resonates, and then we have a deeper sense of our own experience, that's how we catch the Dharma. So on the one hand, we do need to have that back and forth with a teacher, and then the teacher gets to know us and can reflect us back. So my strongest experience of this, of having a sort of that one-to-one connection with a teacher and being personally given a teaching is when I received my name. So when I was ordained, my teacher Vajratara gave me my name. And when she did that, it was like she'd taken in everything that I'd ever told her about myself, and she just absorbed it, and then she was able to offer back, this is the essence of your practice. This is what you need to do to personally reach the goal. This is what your myth is. This is what you need to do in this lifetime. So I needed that one-to-one relationship with a teacher who really got me to know me personally and my blind spots and my working grounds in order for that to happen. And then we need peers too. So we need people at a similar stage to us. We need to have a sense of doing it together. So I was ordained with someone called Tejasvati. And at some point on our ordination retreat, Tejasvati was talking about our minds, and she said that it was not necessarily that she felt happier, but that she felt her mind was so much more malleable. It's a 2.5-month retreat, the ordination retreat, so we were there for quite some time. And when she said that, it's like it unlocked it in me, and then suddenly I could see it as well, like, whoa, my mind is so malleable. But it wouldn't have happened unless she'd said it, so we help each other that way, we unlock things for each other. Happened with Maichi Kumar as well. Maichi Kumar just once said, he was saying, your thoughts aren't facts, and suddenly I could really see my thoughts aren't facts. So someone sees something, and that's why there's sort of no competition in the spiritual life. It's like someone unlocks something, and then it makes it easier for everyone else to see it. So that's how the Dharma is caught. We hear the truth, and then we see it for ourselves. We know it's true, and then insights just start pouring forth. Sometimes you see this in groups, like on this retreat, people are saying things, and they're saying it, but it's like, that's not exactly what was taught. It's like they've caught it, and it's unleashed something in them. And that's because of the Buddha seeds in our hearts, because like we have all the right ingredients for enlightenment already, and that can be activated by communication. So communication can include books as well. But I think it's most powerful with Sangha contact. I think because we need to hear the Dharma, but we also need to see it embodied. So at some point during this seminar with the Buddha and his 5 friends, something happens, and the Buddha looks at one of them and he says, Kondanya's got it. So Kondanya had also broken through into enlightenment. He was the second to reach enlightenment. And when that happened, the 10,000-fold cosmos shivered and quivered and quaked, while a great measureless radiance appeared in the cosmos, surpassing the effulgence of the gods. So that was the beginning of the Sangha. So in a sense, that is also when the Enlightenment experience was completed. In a sense, Enlightenment was not complete until it was communicated. And we can have a sense of that as well, that our experience is not complete until it's articulated, maybe in a check-in in a group, or maybe at the end of the retreat when we talk to a friend about it and we sort of give back our experience, and it can be such a relief. And like a great rain cloud pouring water onto the thirsty earth, the Buddha spent the rest of his long life just communicating the Dharma. So there we go. The story does not end with the bliss of enlightenment. It's completed at least when the spiritual experience is shared with others, and then it starts for others. It starts for them. So the Buddha's enlightenment was sort of the beginning of this unbroken lineage of communication, this unbroken lineage of friendship, all the way up till today. And I think that just makes sense because there's actually no way to practice the Dharma without communicating it. And in a sense, this winter retreat is just the most recent event in Buddhist history, really, which is a history of friendship, a history of communication. So included in any sense of personal liberation, there is that desire for the liberation of others as well. And and that's why I'm here in a sense. In our order and movement, when we're ordained, we take a vow to dedicate our lives to enlightenment for ourselves and for the benefit of all beings. And I think that's us marking our aspiration to live for others in the deepest sense, to live for others and to pass on a little bit of what we've been given. And in my ordination itself, what I think is that was the deepest communication of my life. It didn't require me to do anything sort of particularly uniquely me, and yet it was somehow the deepest communication of my life. And something happened there that was actually beyond words, beyond the sort of verbal communication altogether. It felt actually more like the transmission of a spiritual energy. So I just couldn't imagine actually anything greater to do with my life than to be part of that lineage of communication and friendship, and to do just a little bit to participate in passing it on.